Paul tells us now that in preaching the gospel, he has to flex. He has to become a Jew. He has to become like someone who is under the law, even though he's not under the law, and so on. He has to flex. Why? Number one, Paul has to flex because he does not belong to any of these categories anymore. Paul has to flex because he does not belong to any of these categories anymore. Listen, there are some contexts in which Paul can still think of himself as a Jew. Thus, for example, in Romans 9 and 10, he could wish himself accursed for his kinsmen according to the flesh, to the Jews. He sometimes makes distinctions in Galatians between Jewish Christians and other Christians, and he uses the first person singular or the first person plural to designate his associations. In certain contexts, Paul knows full well that at the end of the day, racially, ethnically, he's a Jew. In fact, in 2 Corinthians 11, he can talk about the fact that he's not just Jewish ethnically, he's not just a child of Israel, but he's a Hebrew of the Hebrews. He was linguistically and culturally formed by this heritage as well. So there are many contexts in which Paul is grateful for this heritage, and he identifies with it. But here he says, to the Jews I became like a Jew, to win the Jews. He assumes that he isn't one. In what sense is he not one? That's why he gives a further definition in the next line. To those under the law. Now that includes Jews, but will also include proselytes. But this is the sense in which he is no longer a Jew. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law. What he means is, he's no longer under the law covenant. He's not introducing complex theories about the exact place of moral law. He is not under the law covenant. He's a Christian. He's under the new covenant. Yes, I know that raises all kinds of complex questions about continuity and discontinuity, but he says it about as bally as you can get. I am not under the law. In that sense, I am not a Jew. So that when I start evangelizing in Jewish circles, then I have to start acting like a Jew. So he goes up to Jerusalem, and some of the authorities say, you know, really good thing if you took on a vow connected with the temple. And he does. He's prepared to flex. And that's what he's prepared to do with Timothy. I want him to come with me. Everybody knows he's a half-breed. He was never done. Sort of common knowledge in the village. Better get him done so he can come with me. So he gets done, and I'm prepared to flex like that. He's not going to say, under no way should any Gentile ever become circumcised. For the sake of evangelism, he's prepared to become like a Jew. But if somebody in Jerusalem says, Titus has to become circumcised in order to be a Christian, then Paul will say, absolutely no way, that jeopardizes the exclusive sufficiency of Jesus. You don't do that. So it's not the act by itself that is so significant. In that sense, it's a bit like the meat issue. It's not the act in itself that is so significant. It's the connections. The connection with a weak conscience, or the connection with whether or not it is jeopardizing the exclusive sufficiency of Jesus. And in this connection, then, Paul does not see himself as a Jew. In fact, he's going to go on and say he doesn't quite see himself as a Gentile either. He is in what the theologians have long called the tertium quid. Whenever you get stuck, quote Latin. The third position. He's in a third position. He's not a Jewish Christian who has to flex when he begins to evangelize in Gentile circles. He's a Christian person who has to flex when he evangelizes Jews, and he has to flex when he evangelizes those who don't have the law. Do you see? The point is that Paul has to flex precisely because he does not belong to any of these categories. Now, the next one is still hard to understand. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. Well, we can understand that. He goes kosher for a while when he's in the right circles, because he's trying to show them his freedom in Christ, even in that regard. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I keep insisting I am not under that law covenant, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, now Gentiles, I became like one not having the law. I have pondered that statement again and again and again. I'm not sure I have it right even now. Because you see, if he's not under the law covenant, what precisely does he have to do to flex to those who don't have any law? What does it mean to flex in that regard? He's already there, isn't he? Well, no, he does have a parenthetical expression that helps us. He says, to those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law. Whoa, wait a minute. You just said you were. Well, he explains, I am not free from God's law in some sweeping sense. I am rather under Christ's law. That is, he is under this new covenant, this mandate from God that has been mediated through Christ, and that will raise all the questions about how you have continuity and discontinuity between the old covenant and the new. But what does he mean when he says, then, though I am not lawless, I am not antinomian, I am not utterly open to anything that comes along, I am rather under Christ's law. I am under his lordship. All that the new covenant, of which Jesus Christ is the head, secured by his own blood, everything that he demands in the structure of the new covenant, I am under that. I can't escape that. But then what does it mean to say that he flexes to those who are under the law? Because after all, he can't escape what it means to be under Christ's law. What does it mean to flex? I think what it means is established in the next line. Just as what it means to be a Jew is established more clearly by saying that they're under the law, and Paul himself is not under the law. So what it means in this context to be free from the law is established by the next line. To the weak I became weak to win the weak. Now, he cannot mean by weak here exactly what he means in chapter 8. He cannot. Because those in chapter 8 clearly are Christians. They're baby Christians. They're Christians with an ill-informed conscience, but they're Christians. Here, however, he speaks of weak whom he wants to win. So they're non-Christians. But if the context and the flow make any difference, you have to understand that these weak ones are weak in the same sense that they're weak in chapter 8. They are probably Gentiles who have got close enough to Christianity that they've got some real problems with idolatry now. Like a lot of God-fearers in the synagogues. The synagogues attracted some who became full-orbed Jews. The men were circumcised. They became proselytes. But the synagogues also attracted in the ancient world some pagans who came to the end of paganism. They didn't like the immorality of the gods. They liked the vision of holiness that seemed to be pushed by Judaism, and they became God-fearers. They had a conscience about some of these things now. They learned their Old Testament. They were Gentiles. They had not become Jews, but they still had a weak conscience. I think those are the people Paul has in mind. That is, they're Gentiles. They don't have the Old Testament law, but they have a weak conscience. And Paul says he'll flex to win them too. He won't eat this meat. He won't do things that betray their troubled conscience, so long as he can remain within all the mandates of what it means to say, I am a Christian. I am in the tertium quid. I am in the third position. I am under Christ's law. There I will not bend. But apart from that, I'll flex, precisely that I may win Christ. So Paul has to flex because he does not belong to any of these categories. Number two, Paul has to flex because he wants to win people in all of these categories. Paul has to flex because he wants to win people in all of these categories. That's what he says in verse 22. To the weak I became weak, to win the weak. I become all things to all people, that by all possible means I might save some. Now get this. This is the important bit. If Paul is in this third position, then as a Christian, he is trying to win these non-Christians on his right and left, if you like, to become Christians like him. If he wants them to become Christians like him, he does not wish to leave them where they are. He's in himself a third position. He's a Christian. He's under the new covenant. He's not saying, I go to the Gentiles and I eat kosher so that I can form a nice kosher messianic community where they still believe that you have to eat kosher in order to accept Jesus the Messiah. And then I come over here to the weak Gentiles, and I don't eat over there, and I'm very careful not to offend their sensibilities. They got a weak conscience, and so that I can win them to Jesus, and they can remain where they are, and they can form a kind of neo-pagan Christian society. A messianic paganism, perhaps. Because he wants to win them. He wants to win them out of where they are to where he is, in the third position, the Christian position, where you have freedom. And that means that if they become Christians, as Paul is a Christian, then they will have to learn to flex to reach their own people. If they really become Christians, they're going to have to flex now to reach Muslims because they're Christians. In fact, you might begin to test whether or not a Muslim has really learned something of that flexibility if you send him to go after Hindus. Do you see? Thus, if you want to flex to make the gospel a little more flexible and accessible, understandable in some postmodern context, some strong postmodern context, for example, where there may be a really deep suspicion of the possibility of knowing truth that actually conforms to reality. There are softer versions of postmodernism than that. But most of the so-called evangelicals who go into postmodernism only seem to me to know the hard versions. If you want to go after them, fine, but you've got to understand that to win them, you've got to bring them back to being a Christian, such that you then have to flex to go after one or the other. You have to flex to go after modernists. Modernists are full of themselves. They're full of their own absolutes. That's true in some profound sense. But postmoderns are full of themselves too. There are idols everywhere. Isn't that what Tim was teaching us? That is where the mistake of C5 is so desperately profound. It doesn't recognize that there are idols in every culture. It's not just in the Muslim world that there are idols. There are idols in the West. There are idols in India. There are idols in South America. There are idols everywhere. And all of us, to become Christians, must leave those idols behind and come under the new covenant. And then there may be some flexibility in which we engage to go after these people, but the aim is not to leave them as C5. Christ-centered community number 5? How is it a Christ-centered community anymore? It isn't a Christ-centered, it's basically a Muslim community with a little bit of Christian gloss. The whole point is to get them into the third position, the Christian position, do you see? From which they then may speak intelligently of flexing in order to do whatever things are, not escaping the mandate of what it means to be under the law to Christ in order to win their particular communities. That's what Paul is talking about here.